Days passed as the ship drifted between bare islands and busy sea lanes, and the strange balance of power held. The pirates played dice and sharpened blades on the deck, while their captive paced, composed verses, and demanded attentive audiences. When they grew rowdy, he silenced them with a curt command and an impatient glare. He joined their exercises, mocked their mistakes in Greek, and wagered small coins he did not possess, promising they would be paid with his ransom. Messengers finally carried word of the captives' plight to the cities of Asia Minor, where Roman allies weighed the risk of angering the pirates against the danger of offending a rising Roman noble. Local officials gathered the required 50 talents, not 20, partly to rid themselves of a troublesome Cilician crew. On the pirates' island base, silver ingots clinked on rough tables as sums were counted. The captive watched closely, reminding them that such generosity confirmed his earlier boast about his own value. Once the pirates accepted the payment, they released him onto the coast near Miletus, confident they had won a fortune and a good story. He stepped ashore without haste, gave them a final, measured look, and repeated his promise of vengeance with the same calm tone he had used in their camp. Then he turned away, travelling inland to Roman authorities, where the weight of silver just exchanged would soon be matched and exceeded by the weight of Roman military power he intended to summon. Winds pressed hard against the sailcloth as the ship cut eastward across a sea roamed by desperate men. Merchant hulls sat low with grain, timber and slaves, tempting predators who watched from hidden inlets and coves. Rome's authority thinned with distance, reduced to the flicker of distant garrisons and the memory of decrees. Beyond sight of land, law yielded to speed, numbers, and the nerve of those willing to board another man's vessel at knife point. On the southern coast of Asia Minor, rocky headlands sheltered fast, shallow drafted boats crewed by hardened Cilician pirates. They knew the currents and shoals better than any magistrate's map, and they measured risk in purses of silver and chains of captives. They struck along the major trade routes, choosing isolated ships heavy with passengers and light on guards. For them, aristocratic travellers from Italy were not symbols of Rome's power, but cargo that could talk and pay for its own freedom. As the vessel carrying the young Roman patrician crossed these waters, its timbers creaked under a more immediate danger than distant civil strife. The crew kept watch, but every unfamiliar sail on the horizon carried the possibility of pursuit. Oars flashed in the sun when lean craft surged from behind a headland, closing the distance with practiced ease. In that sudden rush of shouts, splintering wood, and levelled weapons, high-born learning and pedigree offered no protection at all. The pirates ferried Caesar to their base near Pharmacusa, a rocky island rising starkly from the Aegean. Armed men lounged around makeshift shelters, sharpening blades, dicing, and arguing over shares, while lookouts watched the sea for Roman patrols. Caesar walked among them without haste, his expression composed, his toga dusty from the voyage but worn with deliberate dignity. He spoke in measured Greek and Latin, questioning their routines, their prophets, and their leaders, as if inspecting a temporary household rather than submitting to captivity. At night, the pirates drank and sang around smoky fires, and Caesar joined their gatherings, reciting poetry and political speeches he had composed. When they failed to applaud, he rebuked them as uncultured barbarians and demanded they listen more attentively. Laughter circled through the camp, but it mixed with unease. He joked with a steady voice that once ransomed, he would return with ships to capture them and have them crucified. The men roared at the threat, treating it as a boastful jest rather than a promise. During the long days of waiting, he ordered silence when he wanted to sleep and scolded anyone who disturbed his rest, as though he commanded a legionary encampment. Some pirates grumbled at his arrogance, yet they obeyed, drawn by an odd respect. He joined their athletic games, mocked their clumsier fighters, and argued legal points with their chief over disputes within the crew. The ransom remained in progress, but the boundaries between prisoner and captor had already been distorted by his unshaken confidence. The sea lay calm when the ransom ship finally appeared on the horizon, its sail bright against the blue of the eastern Aegean. The pirates stirred with satisfaction, counting the days they had hosted their unusual captive and now envisioning payment in Roman silver. Caesar watched the preparations with measured detachment, neither grateful nor relieved. Messengers climbed into small boats, chests were hauled across creaking planks, and the agreed sum passed into rough, calloused hands. Freed from his bonds, Caesar did not look back with nostalgia or dread. He gave the pirates a final cool reminder of the fate he had promised them, then stepped aboard the vessel that would carry him to the coast of Asia Minor. From there, he moved with practiced efficiency. He sought out Roman officials, presented his case, and secured ships and soldiers. His status as a young Roman aristocrat and former hostage lent his request an undeniable urgency. Within days, a small flotilla cut back across the same waters where he had once sailed as a captive. Guided by knowledge of the coastline and the pirates' habits, Caesar led the pursuit toward their familiar anchorage among the islands. Oars rose and fell in disciplined rhythm as armed men prepared for boarding. The pirates, who had once laughed at his threats, now faced war galleys, closing in with deliberate speed, the balance of power reversed, but the promised reckoning unchanged. The morning heat pressed down on the camp as Caesar moved among the pirates with an ease that unsettled them. He demanded silence when he wished to sleep, scolded them for noisy games, and ordered them to listen while he recited his verses and speeches. When they laughed, he dismissed their judgment as crude and unlettered. He treated their leaders as social inferiors, speaking not as a man fearing death, but as a magistrate rebuking unruly clients. Word of his behavior spread among the crew, and curiosity mixed with irritation. Some watched him exercise on the strand, guarded yet unshackled, counting aloud as if drilling soldiers rather than pacing out captivity. He joined their meals, but insisted on the best spot and clean water, remarking that his presence elevated their camp. When storms rattled the ships at anchor, he joked that the winds recognized a Roman noble aboard and would not dare overturn his quarters. At night, while men gambled by torchlight, he spoke calmly about the future as though appointments in Rome awaited him rather than a ransom broker on the coast. He reminded the pirates that his family's connections reached the Senate, that officials and moneylenders in Asia knew his name. Each boast reinforced the same message. He was not a prize animal to be traded, but a political actor temporarily inconvenienced, whose value and memory would long outlast their anonymous fortunes. The small squadron slipped back into the Aegean, hugging the same routes that traders and raiders had shared for generations. Oars beat a steady rhythm as the crews scanned the horizon for the low silhouette of the pirate vessels. Caesar stood among officers and hired sailors, pointing out landmarks he had studied during captivity. He knew the inlets where the pirates watered their ships, the coves where they waited for prey, and the rocky island that had served as his prison. At dawn, sails appeared near the familiar island anchorage. The pirates recognized the local shipping they had long intimidated and showed no urgency, assuming another easy inspection of merchant hulls. Only when the Roman prows held their course and closed in formation did shouts rise along the shoreline. Men scrambled to arm themselves, but anchors still dragged in the shallows and rigging hung slack. Caesar's vessels pressed the advantage, driving toward the half-ready ships with disciplined rows of oars and prepared boarding parties. The clash unfolded quickly. Missiles from the Roman decks swept the crowded pirate vessels, forcing men to crouch or leap into the water. Grappling hooks bit into hulls and boarding ramps crashed down as armed contingents surged across. Some pirates tried to push off toward open sea, but tangled anchors and colliding hulls slowed their escape. Others fled inland, only to be run down on the rocky slopes above the harbour. By the end of the engagement, their leaders and many crews lay bound, their own ships now under Roman control. The chained pirates were driven inland under guard, their column kicking dust along the road to Pergamum. Roman soldiers kept tight formation, wary of any attempt at escape, yet the prisoners already sensed that resistance had become pointless. Local onlookers watched the procession with a mix of curiosity and fear. Pirate raids had long haunted these coasts. Now the raiders themselves marched in silence, surrounded by the rigid order of Roman authority. In Pergamum, Caesar entered the governor's residence and presented his captives as proof of both his endurance and his loyalty to Roman interests. Official routines began. Reports were drafted, inventories compiled of the seized treasure, slaves, and ships. The governor's staff weighed political considerations, calculating how these executions might affect local stability and relations with neighbouring powers. Caesar pressed his earlier demand with unshaken confidence, insisting that the punishment he had promised be carried out. When the governor hesitated, concerned with legal formalities and potential diplomatic entanglements, Caesar acted on his own resolve. He secured authority, or at least acquiescence, to proceed and ordered preparations for crucifixion, the standard Roman penalty for pirates. The captured men were led out, their defiance gone, replaced by the realization that the ransom had bought only brief reprieve. Caesar's earlier mocking threats materialized in iron and timber, turning his former humiliation into a measured, lethal response. In the governor's compound, the prisoners lay in chains, while clerks counted their seized silver and tallied the ships, arms, and goods that Caesar's men had taken. The governor's aides moved slowly, exchanging quiet remarks as they inspected the pirates' strong, sea-hardened bodies like merchandise. Caesar watched the measured pace, sensing calculation rather than outrage. Rumours drifted through the courtyard that envoys from coastal towns had already begun discreet inquiries about buying experienced sailors and oarsmen. When Caesar pressed for the crucifixions he had vowed, officials gave him polished answers about legal forms, witnesses, and the need for consultation. The governor listened with a polite expression, then turned the talk toward the costs of imprisonment and the potential value of the captives. Some attendants mentioned markets in nearby cities. Others hinted that certain pirates might prove useful as informants against rival bands. Each delay pushed the executions further into the future and inflated the price of interference. Caesar's irritation hardened into fury as he recognized the familiar shape of provincial corruption. Justice postponed until it could be weighed against profit. He had risked his ships and men, yet watched authority hesitate over men who had terrorized the same waters that supplied Rome's grain. The promise he had made in the pirates' camp now stood in danger of becoming an empty boast. Surrounded by venal calculation, he resolved that the retribution he owed them would not depend on another man's consent. The bodies swayed above the shoreline, timber posts braced in the rocky soil, while the sea wind pressed against the crosses. Local sailors slowed their oars to stare, recognizing faces that had once commanded these waters with impunity. Roman soldiers stood guard at the base of each cross, spears grounded, eyes scanning the horizon for any lingering pirate craft. News of the executions moved quickly through nearby ports carried by merchants who measured every rumor against shifting balances of power. Officials in the province heard of the crucifixions only after the deed had been done, learning that a young Roman aristocrat had acted without waiting for their decrees. Some muttered about jurisdiction and protocol, but the removal of a persistent threat in the Aegean made open protest difficult. In Rome, reports described pirates eliminated and shipping lanes briefly safer, noting that the man responsible had personally overseen the operation, from the pursuit at sea to the final punishment on land. Among those who followed Roman politics, the story spread in fragments: a capture, a ransom paid, verses recited in captivity, and a promise of crucifixion delivered as calmly as a legal argument. Listeners remarked that the same individual had once joked with his captors and then returned as their executioner, a combination of audacity and resolve that did not go unnoticed. In the years that followed, this episode was recalled whenever his name appeared in trials, elections, or military appointments. Long after the bodies of the Cilician pirates had rotted on their crosses, Roman writers still turned back to the sea off Asia Minor. Plutarch and Suetonius described a young noble who treated his kidnappers less as masters than as an unruly audience, mocked them, raised his own ransom, and then hunted them down. The episode stood alongside courtroom speeches and military campaigns as proof that his daring had emerged early, fully formed and unyielding. In the memory of Rome, the pirates' fate mirrored the Republic's widening war against lawlessness in the Mediterranean. Roman merchants, grain convoys, and coastal towns had suffered repeated raids until commanders such as Pompey swept pirate strongholds from Cilicia to Crete. Caesar's small-scale vengeance echoed that larger violence. A Roman elite seizing the initiative, claiming to restore order while displaying terrifying authority. The crucifixions signaled both personal triumph and Rome's growing command of distant waters. Later, Chryses cast the kidnapping in a harsher light. The same figure who had joked with pirates about their future crucifixion marched a legion across the Rubicon without Senate sanction, crushed senatorial armies, and accepted lifelong honors that stirred deep suspicion. Senators who later raised daggers in the theatre of Pompey feared a ruler who turned threats into spectacle and promises into blood. The pirate affair remained a compact parable of his audacity, charisma, and relentless calculating cruelty.